ever tried deciding which cafe to hang out at? You don't just walk into any random cafe which you see at once, right? You look around, you see that is the place crowded, is the vibe chill or chaotic, are people loving the food or not, and then you decide. So whether you realize it or not, you are doing some quick research before making any decision. Now think about it like investing in a company. It's actually quite similar because before picking a company, smart investors don't just look at the profits or the flashy products the company is providing. They zoom out and ask questions like what kind of industry the company is working in. And that's exactly where industry analysis comes to play. So what exactly is industry analysis? In simple terms, it means stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. The environment in which the group of companies are working, similar companies are operating. So instead of zooming out into one company's profits or products, we should ask that how big the market is, who are the major players in that particular market, is the demand rising or falling, and are there any major threats like the new tech or the government regulation. Now let's break it down with a quick example. Say you are looking at Tata Motors. Sure, it's a great brand, but its performance does not exist in isolation or vacuum. So you also need to check that how is the automobile industry going overall? Are electrical vehicles catching up or not? Are the raw material prices like steel and aluminium spiking? Is the government offering EV incentives like FAME 2? Only when you study these factors, then you can judge if Tata Motors is moving with the right or it's just swimming upstream. That's why industry analysis should always be your first step in equity research because it tells you the strategic context. Like there is a SaaS company Zoho and telecom giant like Vodafone Idea. They both may serve millions, but their industries are worlds apart because SaaS, it's an asset-light, fast-growing and high-margin industry. Also, industry analysis helps to separate companies' skills from the industry tailwinds because sometimes companies grow just because the whole industry is booming. Like after COVID, the pharma companies, they saw a surge.
Pharmaceutical firms raking in billions from the global pandemic. Vaccine manufacturer Pfizer and its German partner BioNTech.
But it was not sustainable. It was just happening because after COVID, the demand was at a certain level for the pharma companies. And if anybody thought that this growth is permanent, it was not. Also, industry analysis helps to reveal the hidden risk. Now look at India's two-wheeler market. It was once booming.
India's booming two-wheeler manufacturing industry. Not only is it making waves domestically, but it's also making a huge impact on the global market.
But now it's facing challenges from EVs and new emission norms. So investors who track these industry shifts, they knew that companies like Hero MotoCorp and others, they had to adopt or they will risk the losing ground. So now before you analyze any company, you should always ask that what industry is it actually a part of? It sounds simple, but it's often the first place people go wrong. Example, both Asian Paints and Kansal Nerolac, they make paints, right? But Asian Paints focuses on decorative paints for homes and Kansal, it's a big in industrial and automotive paints. So if you compare them blindly, you are making a mistake and you will miss the differences in the customer base, pricing and even the risk. Also, you can check the official classifications like NSE sectoral indices, DRHPs, IPO documents, and GICS, which are the global industry classification standards. Example, Zomato's DRHP calls it an online food services platform and not a restaurant chain. And that one line, it changes your entire analysis. Now, once you define the industry, it's time for digging for the data. So how you can do it? You can check the government sources like IBEF. It's great for checking the market sizes and trends. You can check the economic survey, RBI, for policy and macro impact. You can check the ministry websites like MNRE for energy, Health Ministry for pharma. You can check company disclosures and annual reports, investor decks, DRHPs, con call transcripts, and check the equity research reports also, which are given by various brokerage houses like from ICICI Securities, Motilal Oswal. You can use it for seeing the sector trends, forecast, and the peer comparisons because every quarterly update is given by these brokerage companies. You can check for news and portals like ET Mint because news also affects the companies and the industry overall. Niche portals can be used like PV Tech for solar, Exchange for media for advertising, and there are unlimited sources. So I think that now you might be able to understood that why industry analysis is must and important. Now let's take the next step. Let's figure out the size and structure of the industry. Because once you know how big the game is, you can decide whether it's even worth playing or not. So, have you ever asked yourself that is this a rupee 500 crores market or a rupee 5 lakh crores market? This is what market sizing answers. It helps you to judge the scale of opportunity and whether it's big enough to attract serious investors' interest or not. And this market sizing usually comes in 3 layers: TAM, SAM and SOM. Think of it like a funnel, big at the top and narrow at the bottom. Now let's make it super simple and use the example of Ola Electric. So TAM basically means the total addressable market. So this is a dream scenario. The total global market for electric 2 vehicles, it's really massive, huge, but let's be honest that Ola cannot sell to the whole world tomorrow, right? So then we come to the SAM, which means serviceable available market. So we get a little real here. Ola mainly sells in India, so its SAM is India EV two-wheeler market. Then comes the SOM, which is serviceable obtainable market. Finally, what can Ola actually get based on its current reach, pricing, factory size, brand pull? Maybe rupees 2500 crores. So that's its SOM. So now the big question is, how can we estimate this TAM, SAM and SOM? So there are 3 solid methods that can be used. So first, let's talk about the top-to-down approach. It's best when you have a reliable industry-wide data. When you, for example, you're analyzing healthcare, banking or FMCG industry, and if you have reliable industry data. So you will start from macro numbers from the trusted sources like from IBEF, NITI Aayog or CRISIL reports, and then you will apply filters like the category, geography and target customer. Then you will narrow it down to what your company can actually serve. Example, in Dr. Lal PathLabs, the India's total healthcare spend is around rupees 6 lakh crores. Diagnostics is 10% of our TAM, so it would be around 61,000 crores. Organized sector is 17% of the TAM, which makes our SAM as around 10,000 crores. And Dr. Lal is in top cities, which makes 30% of the SAM, so which makes our SOM around rupees 3,100 crores. So this method is really structured and quick, but it heavily depends that whether you are having a reliable data or not, which really makes it difficult for new industries. Now the second is bottom-up approach, which is best when the industry is fragmented or emerging, like food delivery or edtech. So you will start with the company level data like revenues or market share. Then you will build up the industry size based on those 2 pieces. Example, Zomato plus Swiggy. So you will combine their revenue, which stands somewhere around, for example, rupees 12,200 crores. Together they control 91% of the market. So total industry size would be around 13,400 crores. So this method works well in competitive, data-rich markets where player-level information is public and macro data is missing. And it's a bit time-consuming and relies on the accurate peer data. Third approach is the hybrid or the user-based approach, and it's best when users matter more than the revenue for the company. It's best for apps, for edtech or for D2C brands. So in the start, you will estimate the number of users or the transactions. Then you will multiply it by the ARPU, that is the average revenue per user. And then you will apply filters to define SAM or SOM. For example, there is an online edtech company, 10 million students, that's our TAM. SAM is 3 million students which are in the metro cities because the company is targeting metro cities. Now the company is planning to target 10% of this 3 million. So that comes to 3 lakh students. So ARPU is 10,000 per year, which makes our SOM 300 crores. So this shows that estimating TAM, SAM and SOM is not just about finding the perfect number. It's about setting a realistic expectation. A rupee 10 lakh crores TAM might sound impressive, but if you can't reach even rupees 100 crores in SOM, the real opportunity may be limited. So basically, it's not about big dreams, it's about the actionable opportunity which you can grab. So let's start with the basic. Market share simply tells us what portion of the total sales of a company holds in particular industry. For example, if Reliance Jio earns rupees 1 lakh crores in telecom revenue and the entire telecom industry earns rupees 2,50,000 crores, Jio's market share is 40%. But market share alone is not enough. We also want to know how concentrated the industry is overall. So industry concentration tells us how evenly or unevenly the total industry revenue is distributed among the companies. So the two most common ways analysts measures this through the concentration ratio, which is the simplest metric. For example, the CR4 is the combined market share of the top 4 companies in an industry. A high CR4 means few firms dominate. Example, in the India telecom industry, Jio, Airtel, Vi. They together control the 90% of the market. And that's highly concentrated industry because it has only a few players, which makes it very tough for the new entrants, and customers often have to choose between the same names. In contrast, if we look at the Indian packaged food market, dozens of brands, many regional players, and many D2C startups popping up constantly. Even giants like ITC and Nestle, they don't hold even more than 10 to 15% in many categories. That's a fragmented market. Second way is through HHI index, and this one is a bit more mathematical, where you square the market share of each company and then add them up. Example, if only one company holds the whole market, HHI is 10,000 and the market is perfectly competitive. It has tons of tiny players, so HHI approaches to 0. Basically, HHI below 1500 indicates a fragmented market. HHI between 1500 to 2500 shows moderately concentrated market, and HHI above 2500 shows a highly concentrated market. Let's say you are analyzing Nykaa and you know it's in the beauty and personal care, but if the market is flooded with low cost competition and unbranded players, even a strong brand like Nykaa, it may need to offer constant discounts just to retain its share in the market. But if you look at something like cement, it has a totally different story. Ultratech, Sheesh Cement, and there are few players to control large portions of the market. So it's harder to enter that market because pricing, it's more stable, and these companies, they enjoy very strong and huge margins. So knowing the market concentration helps to understand that how much pricing power a company has, what are the barriers to entry for the new competition, whether the industry is prone to price wars or it has a steady growth, and the likelihood of mergers and acquisitions shaking up the market. So before investing in any sector, there is one question every smart investors need to ask. Is the industry growing? And if it's growing, then why? We often hear about market size, top players, but to spot the real winners, we need to go deep. We need to know the growth trends, demand drivers. So let's break it down and first ask the question of the historical growth trend. And this is where we look back 5 to 10 years and ask, has the industry grown? At what speed? What were the growth drivers? Was the growth consistent or not? And we look at 3 things: direction, speed, and pattern. Because direction tells us that the industry is expanding or shrinking. Speed tells us that are we seeing a 5% annual growth or a 25%. And pattern tells us that is the growth steady or it's full of up and down. Take the example of Indian smartphone market. From 2014 to 2020, it was booming. Millions were upgrading from feature phones, growth was double digit, but post 2021, things slowed and everyone who wanted phone already had one. Now let's flip to the second piece of the puzzle, which are the demand drivers. These are the factors that the people or businesses spend in a sector. But every sector has its own set of drivers. So let's go through some of the major industries one by one and let's know about their growth drivers. For example, if we talk about the FMCG, consumer staple business, they are your daily need essentials, soap, biscuit, oil, and demand is stable. But growth comes from rising rural income, greater brand penetration in villages, better distribution in tier 3 and 4 towns, and shifting life cycle choices like moving from regular to green tea. Example, Patanjali grew fast by offering branded, affordable options to rural India, and they knew that what they are targeting. Through Ayurveda and everything, they targeted the audience. Then we talk about the consumer discretionary like auto, apparel, QSR, and this is want-based spending. This is not the need, this is a want of people. So growth often depends on the higher disposable income of people. Easy EMI, financing, urbanization, more working women, and lifestyle aspirations. For example, in 2010, Alto used to rule the Indian roads, but 2018, SUV craze is crazy. Brezza, Nexon, they are rising into the middle class aspirations. Now, if we talk about the healthcare and pharma, the sector is driven by India's aging population, expanding healthcare insurance coverage, government schemes like Ayushman Bharat, and a growing preventive health mindset. Example during COVID, diagnostic boom. Post-COVID, companies pivoted to wellness testing, and that's now a solid growth engine. Talking about financial service, growth here ties to the economy. Like the interest rates, if they are low, more borrowing. Digital tools like UPI, Aadhaar, more urban jobs, and rising retail investor activity. So platforms like Zerodha, Grow, they exploded after 2020 when young investors, they started investing in the stock market and they get more aware about it. Talking about the real estate and construction, their growth is driven by interest rates affecting the EMIs, job growth sectors like IT, BFSI, policies like PMA, RERA, and more nuclear families and more homes. Example, post-COVID, remote work pushed housing demand in tier 2 cities like Indore and Lucknow. Talking about the tech, internet and edtech companies or industry, what drives growth into that fast-moving sector? The accessibility to cheap data and devices, user habits and trust, clear regulations which are crucial for crypto, gaming, edtech, and strong cost-value equation. So we can take the example of Byju's, an academy which grew rapidly during lockdowns, but now as the schools have reopened, their focus is on quality and retention because obviously people are moving to the offline modes now. Talking about industry and manufacturing sector, here the demand comes from the government infra push, corporate capex plans, exports rising due to China Plus One strategy and commodity price trends. Example, if we talk about Siemens, they are riding high on India's energy transition, all thanks to the strong infra orders. So why go through all this? Because past growth tells you the momentum. But the demand drivers, they tell you that whether this momentum will remain stable or not. For example, if we take the example of the electric two vehicles, which grew 30% annually in the recent years. Great, right? But if that growth was driven mostly by subsidies, what happens if those subsidies cut down? Now look at the health insurance growing slowly but supported by long-term drivers like rising cost and awareness. So this is the difference which demand drivers tells us. Whether the growth should be slow but it should be steady. Now coming to this point, we may feel that every industry looks competitive on the surface, but not all the competition is created equal. Some industries allow companies to earn fat margins year after year, and others, they are stuck in price wars, consumer discounts, razor thin profits. So how do we know that which company is in which category? So here we can take the help of Porter's 5 forces model. It's a super practical framework which analysts use to decode industry's true competitive intensity. So whether you are looking at paint, telecom or tech, this tool helps you to answer one key question. That is this a good space to be in, and how hard is to stay profitable in this industry?
The basic idea of the competitive forces starts with the notion that competition is often looked at too narrowly by managers. And the 5 forces say that yes, you're competing with your direct competitors, but you're also in a fight for profits with a broader extended set of competitors, customers who have bargaining power, suppliers who can have bargaining power, new entrants who might come in and kind of grab a piece of the action, and substitute products or services that essentially place a constraint or a cap on your profitability and growth. So the 5 forces is kind of a holistic way of looking at any industry and understanding the structural underlying drivers of profitability and competition.
So the first force is the threat of new entrants. It tells you that if there are high entry barriers like in the cement, which would protect profits, and low entry barriers which would attract competition and squeeze margins like in the D2C brands. Next, we talk about the bargaining power of buyers. If you have too many options, it would make buyers push prices down, in contrast to FMCG brands which enjoy the loyalty and the pricing power. Then we have the bargaining power of suppliers. If the few suppliers control inputs like the rare chemicals or AI talent, they can eat into the margins unless the company can pass on the cost. The fourth force is threat of substitutes. Alternatives like OTT versus cable TV, they can disrupt the entire sector We need to watch the changing consumer preferences. And finally, the industry rivalry, in which the intense competition like in telecom means price wars, whereas low rivalry as in the paints, it allows a stable growth and better margins. Now let's shift our gear. Once you know the competitive landscape, the next big question which comes in, what does it cost to run the business and how scalable it is? Because growth alone is not enough. Profitability, scalability is what truly matters. We break this down into 3 key areas: cost structure, supply chain, and capex intensity. So every industry has a different cost mix. But what matters is how these costs behave as revenue grows. We have fixed costs, variable costs, semi-variable costs. So fixed costs are like salaries, rent, depreciation. They don't change with sales. So high fixed costs, high operating leverage. Variable costs are the raw material, packaging, commissions. As the sales rise, they also rise. So they are the flexible costs. And semi-variable costs are the utilities, logistics, maintenance, and they are a mix because some control is possible on them. For example, there is a biscuit brand like Parle. It has high variable costs, so scaling does not lower the unit cost much. But Zoho, which is a SaaS company, it has high fixed costs. So after the product development, adding users, almost the cost is nothing. That's real scalability. Now let's talk about the sector benchmarks, because margins reveal a lot about scalability and pricing power. For example, FMCG, 40 to 60% gross margins, limited by the raw material costs. Then we have the cement industry, 30 to 40% margins, majorly hit by power and freight expenses. Software, 45 to 55% margins, because scalable to people-driven models. Auto OEMs, 25 to 35% margins because they are under pressure from the steel and electronics. Talking about EdTech platforms, 60 to 70% margins because high marketing spends reduce the profitability. Now let's talk about how capital intensive an industry is, because different industries, they have very different capex needs. Talking about high capex, cement and steel, they need huge investments in plants, logistics. Then the moderate capex, FMCG, QSR chains like Domino's, they require kitchen, cold chains, branding. And low capex, it comes in the software and EdTech because they mainly need talent, product development. There is very low physical assets and physical cost. A good way to assess capex burden is through the capex to sales ratio, because if this ratio exceeds 30%, it indicates that the company must continuously reinvest heavily just to maintain or grow its scale. And high capex companies often have strong moats due to high entry barriers, but they also take longer to reach their break-even point. In contrast to the low capex businesses, which scales really quick but are more vulnerable to competition because low entry barriers. For example, we take DMart. It owns its store, so high capex, but this gives control over sourcing, warehousing, operations. Margins are thin, but operational efficiency drives high ROCE, inventory turnover. Talking about Unacademy, on the other hand, it needs minimal capex to scale because they just need tech, faculty, marketing. It grows fast, but unit economics depend heavily on the user retention and consumer acquisition cost. Now that we have covered supply chains and capex intensity, it's time to get the heart of any business, unit economics. No matter the sector, QSR, SaaS, e-commerce or EdTech, the core question remains, is each scale profitable? Unit economics answers that by breaking down revenue and cost per unit. A unit could be an order or a user, a trip, depending on the business. But here is the basic formula. Unit contribution is equals to revenue per unit minus variable cost per unit. For example, we take e-commerce. If average order value is rupees 1000 and your cost, which is the packaging, delivery, discount, it's around rupees 800. So your unit contribution is rupees 200. Now if your fixed costs like salaries and all, they adds up to rupees 10 crores. You need to fulfill 5 lakh such orders just to break even. So even if the top line is growing, if the unit economics is negative, you are scaling losses, not profits. This is why businesses like Swiggy, Unacademy, they are always under pressure to improve their retention, cut their CAC, because they rely heavily on the repeat usage, and high churn breaks their model. Next, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, which is industry outlook and structural dynamics. Forecasting industry growth is not about guessing a single number. It's about building a range of scenarios based on evidence and logic. Usually we have three cases: the bear case, which assumes the current trends continue steadily or not; bull case, which imagines the best possible outcome if the tailwinds accelerate; and the bear case, which prepares for risk and headwinds that could slow down the growth. But before you jump into the numbers, you should ask yourself that is the growth sustainable? Because not all the growth is equal. Some comes from real demand driven by demographics or policy like FMCG or renewable energy, and other growth is speculative, fueled by hype or loose credit like some crypto or penny stocks. So let's take an example of Indian electric two-wheelers. The bear case assumes subsidies and charging infrastructure lags, which leads to 8% growth. Base case assumes current policies continue and adoption grows steadily at 20% growth. And the bull case factors in new subsidies and surging petrol prices, pushing the growth to 30%. So tables like this, they help everyone to visualize the range of outcomes and associated risk clearly. We can use the key data sources like IBEF, InvestData, Statista for global benchmarks, government portals like Niti Aayog for strategy papers, broker reports for consensus views, and financial databases like CMIE or Refinitiv to build your models. Always cross-verify across 2 to 3 sources to avoid the bias. So this tells us that forecasting is not about nailing a perfect number. It's about mapping a realistic possibility. Your base case is the main route, the bull case is the fast time, and the bear case, it is the doubter when the trouble hits. So the best analysts don't just predict, they prepare for every outcome with a clear and logical map. Now let's talk about the economic sensitivity and cyclicity. How industries respond to the ups and downs of the economy. Every sector behaves different during the economic cycles. Some thrive when the economy booms, but some struggles during the downturns. So others say relatively steady regardless of economic shifts. This behavior is called cyclicity or economic sensitivity, and it is really crucial for understanding risk and timing in your investment. So let's talk about the types of industries based on the sensitivity. The cyclical industries are highly sensitive to GDP growth and consumer sentiment. For example, auto, real estate, metals, hotels. And then comes the defensive industries, which remain stable through cycles because their products or services are always needed. Example, FMCG, pharma, utilities, and telecom. Then come the interest rate sensitive industries, which react strongly to the changes in the interest rate. Like we have banking, NBFC, housing finance, and auto loans. Then comes export linked industries, which depends on the global demand cycle. Like the IT services, textile, chemicals. But how can we identify the industry cyclicity? So for this, you have to check the revenue volatility. You have to look at the 5 to 10 years of the sales data, the historic 5 to 10 years sales data, and if the revenue rises and falls with the GDP or the market mood, you know that this industry is cyclical. You have to understand the end-use demand. Products which are bought on credit or are linked to the business capex, they are mostly tend to be cyclical. You have to track the correlation with macro indicators like the GDP growth, interest rate, rural wages, commodity prices. All of this offer the clues. And then at the last, you can review the management commentary because companies, they often discuss that how the macro conditions would further impact their demand. So let's take an example of the automobile industry because autos, they are highly cyclical. Because in good times, consumers upgrade or they buy the new vehicles, but during the slowdown or during the inflation spikes, purchases, they really get delayed. Interest rates, fuel prices, they are also heavily impacted. For example, from FY17 to FY19, rising income and easy credit, they boosted the sale of auto. But after 2019, factors like emission norm changes, liquidity issues, COVID-19, all of this led to sharp volume decline. Now, why all this matters for forecasting and valuation? Because cyclicity affects how you model the future earnings and assign valuation multiples. Like cyclicals can look cheap at the peak of a boom, like when you have high earnings, low PE, but earnings often drop soon after. And talking about defensive trades, they trade at higher multiples but provide steady cash flow and downside safety as well. So a common mistake is extrapolating peak earnings in cyclicals, industries like auto, steel, real estate, they often post record profits when they are working in the boom year. But that's not the norm. So you have to understand this thing that is occurring occasionally when the GDP is also at the boom. So knowing how an industry reacts to economic cycles, it basically helps you to build smart forecasts with the right level of caution and optimism. Avoid the value traps by not overpaying when earnings are temporarily inflated, and time your investments better since cyclical rewards well-timed entries and exits more than the defensives. So always ask yourself, is this industry riding a short-term cycle or building a long-term value? Now let's shift focus to a crucial but sometimes overlooked driver of the industry performance, which are policy, regulations and incentives. So what kind of policy influences and shape the industries? First, we can talk about the incentive schemes because these are designed to boost the demand or supply by reducing the cost. Think of FAME 2 scheme for electrical vehicles, the production linked scheme, which is the PLI scheme, which is launched for manufacturing, and PMAY scheme for affordable housing. These incentives low barriers and can accelerate the growth dramatically. Next, we can talk about the regulations, which are the set compliances and safety standards. For example, RERA is a set standard for real estate transparency, SEBI regulations for brokers, and FSSAI guidelines for food safety. So these rules often shape how companies compete and operate with each other. We also have price controls and subsidies where the government can price or offer financial support. Like fertilizer subsidy or electricity tariff cap, they are classical examples, which can significantly affect profitability in those sectors. Import and export tariff are another important lever. Duties on steel exports or solar panel imports, for instance, influence the domestic pricing and trade flows, reshaping the competitive landscape. And finally, licensing and entry barriers determine who can legally operate, whether it's banking license or telecom spectrum auctions. These rules control the market access and expansion possibilities. But why all this matter for us? Because policy does not create a framework, it creates market. For example, digital payments. The Unified Payment Interface, the UPI, it revolutionized how India pays, but it only took off because the government pushed for it. Similarly, GST formalized logistics and warehousing sectors, accelerating the growth. Incentives can also turbocharge the sectors. The rapid rise of solar power, electrical vehicles, textiles, semiconductors, they owe a lot to targeted government schemes and tax breaks. Regulations also shape competition by setting the standards and determine who can thrive in this sector. Because in education, only asserted institutions grow. In banking, capital norms limit credit disbursements are there. But policy, it is also a source of risk. Because sudden shifts like bans on high emission vehicles or abrupt changes in custom duties, they can disrupt markets and throw forecast off balance. Let us look at some real life examples to get a better understanding. Like the electrical vehicle sector, they saw a huge jump in their sales, about 200% growth in 2022 due to the FAME 2 subsidy that lowered the battery cost. But now, uncertainty over the continuation of these subsidies makes companies cautious about their future investment. Talking about the real estate, the rollout of RERA, it brought much needed transparency, improving buyer confidence and helping established players like DLF, Godrej Properties gain the market share. Then the PLI scheme in solar manufacturing attracted major investments from Reliance, Tata Power, Adani and really big names, scaling up the India's capacity. Talking about telecom companies like Vodafone Idea, it got benefited from regulatory moratorium or spectrum payments, easing the financial pressure, though the debates on tariff floors continue to affect profitability. Even emerging sectors like online gaming, they have felt the policy shocks, like the sudden imposition of a 28% GST that dramatically altered the economies for startups. So we use these policy insights to refine our forecast because if demand is policy driven like the rooftop solar installations, we need to factor in whether the policies will continue, expand or expire. We should also assess the profit sustainability because industries like fertilizers or oil marketing, they often depend on subsidy reimbursements. And any delay or cut can quickly change the earnings outlook. Policy also helps us to gauge entry barriers, which are critical for sectors like education, fintech, where licensing control the market access. For export-oriented sectors, monitoring global trade policies, anti-dumping duties, ESG regulation in importing countries is equally important. So to stay updated, reliable sources are there, the ministry portals, SEBI, RBI, industry associations, and always remember that announced policies don't always translate into implemented policies. So you have to cross-check the execution status and the budget allocation carefully regarding that policy in a particular sector. So in conclusion, policy is not just a background noise. It's often the steering wheel of entire industry. A single regulation can open or close multi-thousand crores opportunity, and incentives can decide who wins and who fails behind. And uncertainty can keep investors on the sidelines no matter the sector's potential. So when you analyze any industry, always ask who is writing the rules and how might those rules change tomorrow. Now that we have understood the market size, structure, demand drivers, next crucial step is to know about the framing of industry growth and profitability outlook, because this goes beyond just projecting numbers, because it's about setting the realistic expectation for how fast an industry will grow, whether the margins will hold or improve, and how efficiently capital will be deployed. So these factors directly impact how investors value the stocks within the sector. So how do we frame growth expectations? Start by asking that how fast is the industry expected to grow in the coming next 2, 3, 5 years and why? For this, you have to look at the historical growth first. Was the industry growing 5% annually or 25%? And is this pace sustainable or not? Next, you have to evaluate the quality of growth. Like, is this growth policy driven, structural or cyclical? Also, you have to consider that whether the growth is coming from increased volumes or just the higher prices. So within the industry, some sub-segments, they may grow faster than the other. For example, premium skincare, it might outpace mass market products. Take the Indian diagnostic sector for an example. Pre-COVID, it used to grow at a 10 to 12% CAGR. But during the pandemic, testing volumes surged, but now we are moving into a post-COVID phase where the growth is normalizing, driven by more preventive healthcare and chronic care awareness. So an ideal view here could be moderate, sustainable growth led by increased health consciousness. Now let's assess the profitability outlook. This involves understanding the cost structure, operating leverage, and how intense the competition is. To know about this, we should look at the key metrics like EBITDA margin trend over the past 3 to 5 years and see that are the margins improving, stable, or declining. Gross margins, which tells us about the pricing power or the input cost volatility. Return ratios like ROCE, ROE among the top players. And capital intensity, meaning how much capex is needed relative to sales and the efficiency of working capital management. Like take an example of Indian cement industry. Margins here tend to be cyclical and sensitive to power and fuel costs, but top players like Ultratech, they benefit from scale and cost efficiency, delivering consistent ROCE above 10%. Hence, the analyst view would be stable profitability in a large consolidated market with selective pricing power in key regions. And when making forecasts, it's better to use ranges instead of a single point estimates to reflect the real world uncertainties, because we cannot be 100% sure. So keeping a range is always better. For example, revenue growth might be forecasted at 9 to 11% CAGR, driven by urbanization in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities and increasing the preventive healthcare. EBITDA margin might stabilize between 18 to 20% with limited scope for further price increases. ROCE for lending companies could range from 14 to 16%, reflecting healthy returns supported by scale and asset-light expansion. So it's also important to connect these forecasts to market valuation. For example, if a sector is growing at a 10% CAGR, but trading at a 35 times price to earnings ratio is likely pricing in a very optimistic scenario. Finally, how does this outlook translate into the stock implications? Like the growth and profitability outlook helps the investors decide that is the premium valuation justified? Are we entering the sector at a right point in this cycle? And should the sector be viewed as a long-term compounding investment or a tactical or a short-term play? So you have to compare the points versus the textile. For example, you are comparing paints versus textile. So paints typically show 11 to 13% growth, EBITDA margins over 20% and high ROCE justifying a premium multiple. But textiles, on the other hand, they grow more slowly at a 6 to 8% rate. They face margin pressures. They operate in fragmented market. So valuations tend to be discounted and timing the entry is more crucial. So to wrap up this section, which is not just a summary, it's where you help equity investors answer, is this industry positioned for above average earnings growth? Will it sustain the superior capital returns? Is the capital underestimating or overestimating the next 3 to 5 years? So strong growth combined with stable and improving margins is very rare and valuable. And that's where investors want to put their money. So always end by clearly stating that is the industry outlook strong enough to support multiple expansion or just stable enough to justify holding the stock. Let's now discuss a key aspect of equity research, which is understanding structural risk and policy catalysts. And this goes beyond the earning projections because it's about identifying the long-term threats that could permanently hurt our industry framework and spotting external triggers that can unlock the fresh growth or a re-rating valuation. So we'll ask two key questions here. What could go structurally wrong in this sector? And what external changes could turn the tide in this sector? So talking about structural risk, these are the persistent challenges that affect the valuation, return and business models. These include the regulatory pressures like the price caps in the diagnostic or insurance, tech disruptions that make the legacy models irrelevant like UPI and banking, it is a classic example. Input cost volatility like the pharma's reliance on the imported APIs. Overcapacity or fragmented markets causing the price wars which we usually see in real estate or the unorganized textiles. ESG related pressures which raise compliance costs in sectors like cement or thermal power. So analysts must identify these risks by tracking the supplier concentration, regulatory trend, rising competition and cautious management commentary. These factors must reflect in our valuation, be it DCF assumption or multiple we assign. On the flip side, policy catalysts are triggers that change a sector's direction, usually through government action or return. So these include PLI schemes that de-risk the capex or scale the business, formalization measures like the RERA, GST because they benefited the players, import tariffs affecting the international industries and protecting the domestic industries, increased infra spending that lifted the demand across the core sectors, ease of doing business reforms that improves the investor sentiments. So however, we must evaluate whether these triggers are already priced in, how long they take to play out and whether their impact is broad-based or company-specific. Like diagnostic face price controls but benefit from rising insurance adoption, auto components risk disruption from EV but gain from battery localization incentive, telecom sees pricing pressure but they benefit from 5G and AGR relief. So in short, understanding the sector level risk and catalyst is very important because earnings alone does not drive the growth or re-rating. Structural headwinds can compress the valuation while positive triggers they need execution to truly reflect into the stock prices. So always ask, is this upside worth the risk and how soon will the market price it in? So now that we have covered the industry growth, profitability outlook and structural risk and policy catalyst, let's bring it all together with some final thoughts. So you should ask yourself, is this sector truly positioned for above average earnings growth over the next 3 to 5 years? Will this earnings growth sustain the strong capital returns that rewards the shareholder consistently? Or the market may be overestimating the growth potential and underestimating the risk ahead? Because a strong growth story combines stable or improving margins, that rare and a valuable combination. It's where you typically see investors flowing in aggressively. So when you conclude, be clear that is the outlook strong enough to justify the expanding valuation multiples, or it is just a story of stable growth that justifies holding the stock but not expecting major re-rating. So this clarity will help you to understand whether they are looking at a compounding wealth creator or a more tactical investment. And with that, you have framed a complete, nuanced view of industry, one that helps you to go beyond just numbers to capture the real risk opportunities and how they translate into the stock market outcomes.